Hello, this is section two of the PowerPoint. So we're going to be talking about Japan all the way up through World War One. Whereas the last, oh, let me present. Whereas the last section of this of Japan's journey was kind of the biggest issues were about the domestically getting modernized and revolutionizing. This section is more focused on Japan's emerging role on the world stage and some neat issues with the Americans. So let's get into it. So Japan and Korea. We're in the year 18, we're in the 1870s, and Japan is more or less ready to start getting involved into world affairs. Now, of course, we're in the 1870s, so the world is not exactly a nice place. And what Japan sees going on around in the world is a lot of imperialism, a lot of colonialization, a lot of taking advantage of weaker countries. That's kind of the game of late 19th century politics. You have to either conquer or be conquered. So Japan decides it's going to pursue a kind of aggressive foreign policy with Korea, its next door neighbor. So for context, Korea was called a hermit kingdom because it was actually similar to Japan in the fact that there was a lot of isolationist sentiment, and it wasn't exactly big on trading with foreigners. So in an ironic move, what I find really ironic, Japan goes to Korea with gunboat diplomacy, forces them to open their ports to Japanese trade, remarkably similar to how America forced Japan to open their trade back in 1853, except now it's Japan and Korea in 1876. So they also do the extraterritoriality kind of deal where Japanese law applies to Japanese foreigners in Korea in the ports. So Korea becomes a Japanese export site for a lot of key Japanese goods. Again, and this is extremely similar to what America did to Japan, and Japan goes ahead and does it to Korea. And this is kind of the beginning of a fraught relations with the Koreans that contains events that create tension in today's world between Japan and Korea. But at any rate, Korea is not a colony. It's not even close to a Japanese colony at this point, but rather just a sphere of influence, which is Japan. Japan is going to try to dominate. And to do that, they have to and right now they're going to have to vie for influence with China. Historically, Korea has been a tributary state of China, and if we're talking about pre-modern history, the Korean state was very submissive to China. China was the dominant power in the region, the extremely ancient culture. One of the oldest continuous civilization in the world is the Chinese. So China has a lot of influence in Korea, and if Japan wants to increase their power, increase their dominance over Korea to be an imperialist power like the West, they're going to have to start getting rid of this Chinese influence. So there's a lot of tension in the years going up to 1894. In between the 1870s, 1894, those 2 decades, a lot of vying for influence between China and Japan. A lot of tension. Each are going to try to put more troops in Korea. They're going to try to get the Koreans to listen to them more. They're kind of fighting each other in Korea, which sounds a little weird, and it's not exactly favorable for the Koreans, but that's what ends up happening. So part of the reason why Korea becomes kind of this political battleground is because Korea is a very ununified state at this point. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, of political dissatisfaction with the dynasty ruling Korea. So there is a lot of infighting and almost no national unity. So Japan takes this opportunity to insert themselves. So what do? They insert Japanese troops into Korea. They station Japanese troops literally in Korea to protect their diplomats, but it's really a move to increase their influence. They send advisors to the Korean court to help them make decisions, quotation marks. In reality, they're just trying to make Korea as close to a colony as they can. And now, of course, the Chinese are doing similar moves here to stop the Japanese from doing this because they want the power. A major one of them, and again, this is 2 decades, and I'm going through it very quickly because it's only tangentially relevant to the history of Japan, what exactly they do to vie for power. But one of the major issues of tension leading up to the first Sino-Japanese War, which I'll get to in a second, is there was a coup. Some Koreans, pro-Japanese Koreans, they supported Japanese influence over Chinese influence, attempt a coup. But China actually helps Korea put down that coup because they don't want a pro-Japanese government in Korea. And that's definitely not a very popular move in Japan. There's a lot of calling for war, a lot of warmongering in this the putting down of this attempted coup by the Chinese. But Japan, a smart move actually for Japan, they choose not to go to war before this time period, 1880s, sometime in the 1880s. They don't choose to go to war then because they want this extra opportunity to continue modernizing, to continue the reforms they started in the Meiji Restoration to make themselves stronger. They're effectively biding their time until 1894. So in those 20 years, in summary, basically, China and Japan vie for influence in Korea, and Japan continues to build up its military and economic might. In 1894, that's when things get interesting with the Tonghak Rebellion. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Disclaimer. So basically, what the Tonghaks were, they were an anti-foreigner religious zealot group in Korea, and they stage a coup, right? They stage a coup in Korea, and of course, the Korean government does not want to be overthrown, so they ask China for help putting down the coup. But Japan obviously does not want a bunch of Chinese troops surging into Korea because after the war, do you think they're going to leave? No, they're not going to leave. They're going to stay in Korea and help the Chinese control Korea more than Japanese. So they don't like that. And so Japan, under the excuse that, oh, these Chinese troops are going to be a threat to our Japanese troops, they send a lot of Japanese troops to Korea, even though Korea didn't ask them for Japanese troops. They asked for Chinese troops to help put down this rebellion. So basically what this rebellion starts is the first Sino-Japanese war. I'll get to that in 1 second, but before that, just for the sake of chronologically ordering things, it's an important note. In the 1890s, Japan has really made a lot of progress politically, socially, economically. They're a completely different country than they were when the Americans came to open them up, and the Europe starts to recognize this, and so Japan, and it starts with Japan and Britain, but it's a widespread movement with Japan and a lot of Western nations to revise those unequal treaties that were so unpopular and led to the Meiji Restoration. So they revise them. Japan can set their own tariffs and taxes in their ports. They get to apply Japanese law. They regain a lot of the key elements of their sovereignty that they were lacking under these unequal treaties. And this is actually just before the first Sino-Japanese War. So that's just something I should mention, that Japan is increasing its influence on the world stage leading up to the first Sino-Japanese War. And now the first Sino-Japanese War. Of course, it was a war. There were a lot of battles. It's a very detailed topic. But in summary, China gets destroyed. They put up a fight. They didn't get completely steamrolled, but Japan wins pretty soundly in the naval battles and the sea, fighting. China was, again, it was weak in this time period, and the Japanese had been becoming stronger. So what comes out of this first Sino-Japanese War, Japan gets a lot of influence in Korea. It would be a lie to say that they now control Korea, but China loses a ton of influence if Japan takes it from them. So now they have a lot more say in what Korea is going to do. They have a lot more say over Korea's economy, and they can design it in a way so that's going to help the Japanese, because they kicked out the Chinese, and the Koreans can't stop them because Koreans are weak and the Chinese are now weak. So Japan can do basically whatever they want with respect to Korea. With not totally. There are other influences they're going to have to counter, but they get a lot more influence. They also get this is probably the best war, one of the best wars for Japan, because they get a lot of land out of this. They get Taiwan. Taiwan, as we know, it's currently an independent country, but they get the island, so that's nice. It's even if it's not super economically important, it's a nice point of pride for the Japanese. The Taiwanese actually rebel significantly against Japanese occupation, but Japan puts them down. So Japan does end up with Taiwan. Japan gets a lot of territory in the Liaodong. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Liaodong Peninsula. It's what's circled in red there. They don't necessarily control it per se, but they get a lot of influence there too. They get territory and resources. China pays indemnity to Japan for the war. They get reparations for the war, so that's nice. That's a big plus domestically. It makes the government a lot more popular at home because China's going to foot the bill. And they also get more Chinese ports for trading. Basically, very, very good. The Japanese public was very happy with this some treaty, because they get a lot of things. And this is really what's important about this. I want to emphasize this, that this is a big conflict, the first major conflict that Japan comes out of as a victor. It's validation that what they have been working on for the past 40 or so, 4 decades has been working. Their westernization, their modernization has made them into a more powerful country, that they can take on China. And while this is also certainly a point of pride for the Japanese, it makes them more nationalistic, it makes them happy, it makes the government eager to get into another fight. It also increases their pride on the world stage. It increases how other countries see them. Because you have to remember, Japan was seen as nothing, and China was seen as the major Asian power. They have an old continuous civilization, a lot of trade going on, a huge country. Japan was nothing relative to China before the Sino-Japanese War in the eyes of the West, in the eyes of the United States, in the eyes of Europe. After beating China, Japan kind of reorders its rank on the leaderboard of the world stage. It's a lot more Japan is taken a lot more seriously by the West after defeating China. They're seen as the up and coming Asian power. They're seen as someone whose influence is increasing as compared to China, whose influence is decreasing. Japan is taken a lot more seriously. And I put a quote on here because it kind of accurately sums up how a lot of people are starting to see the Japanese, is that, I'll read it out for you. Japan has within 40 years gone through the various administrative phases that occupied England in about 800 years and Rome about 600. And I'm loath to say that anything is impossible with her. 40 years, that's really a short time period. And I want to drive that home, that the industrialization and modernization of Japan was an extremely quick process. And it leads to this victory in the First Sino-Japanese War. Now, moving on, now for reference, we're at the end of the 19th century, going into the beginning of the 20th century, just for the time period. The next obstacle to Japan, one of the next obstacles to Japan on the world stage is Russia. We don't think of Russia and Japan as really having much of ties together, but if you look at a map, they're pretty close. Russia's a big place. But what happens is the Koreans don't really like the Japanese, as I mean, it's pretty understandable. So in order to kind of balance how much influence the Japanese have, they increase their ties of Russia, and Russia starts putting a lot more effort into having influence over Korea. So the Koreans, they welcome that because they don't want Japan to have 100% power over them. So they kind of play the two against each other so that they can have a moment to breathe. But a lot of Russian diplomats come to Korea, Russian troops, all that. And Russians even take some Japanese territory in the Liaodong Peninsula. It doesn't spark a war, but it shows that Russia and Japan are getting more and more not nice to each other in the years after the First Sino-Japanese War. But that leads to, not yet, okay. And then now we're literally at the turn of the 19th century. We're in the 1900s. This is another interesting thing. Now, this actually has to do with America, Japanese-American relations. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Who were the Boxers? They were anti-foreign, anti-Christian Chinese rebels. They had some similarities to the Tonghaks in Korea, but they were completely Chinese. And they tried to stage a coup against the Qing dynasty of China. It was a Chinese rebellion. But the key point of it is that they're anti-Christian. They really hate Christians. So the Western world really does not like them. And the Western world really cares about what China is going to do, because China is a huge place with a lot of economic consequences for these colonial powers. So Germany, Russia, Britain, France, and the United States all agree we're going to send troops to China and show these anti-Christian fools who's boss. And Japan also decides they'll help. They'll help fight the Boxers to defend the Chinese government, the current one, from these anti-foreigner ones. And why do they do it? They don't do it so much because they care about the anti-Christian thing. They don't care at all. Japan is not a very Christian country. But what they care about is increasing their influence in Asia. And if there's going to be a major conflict in Asia with all of these big countries fighting, Japan wants to be a part of it so that they don't get left out of the spoils of war afterwards. They also want to assert themselves as a power in Asia. So they joined and helped fight the rebellion. And now basically what follows from this is that the Japanese and Americans are fighting on the same side. And whenever two countries fight on the same side of a war, that always increases the friendliness between the two nations. So in the 1900s, Japanese and Americans fight in the same war against the Boxers, strengthening their relations as a countries. It makes them more friendly. Um, Another thing, Japan actually sent the largest force out of any of them because they don't like to be outdone. Yeah, they don't want to be outdone, and another consequence of the Boxer Rebellion is that the British and Japanese relations are actually strengthened. This is a PowerPoint about Japanese-American relations, but it's important to acknowledge that Britain and Japan actually get on pretty good terms. Why? Because both don't like the Russians. Britons have a very adversarial relations with the Russians in Europe. They're rivals, and the Japanese don't like the Russians. Why? Because they're in Korea. They're bothering them in Korea, trying to take the influence they won in the first Sino-Japanese War away from them. So the Japanese are very, very cautious with Russia, and they want to protect themselves against a future war. So they signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, which says that if Japan and another country attacks either of them, they'll form an alliance and fight each other. So that's an important alliance that's going to play a role coming up